Now, we have invented this thing in society called the ledger. No, not Heath Ledger. The ledger, like bookkeeping, entries, debits, and credits. And the ledger is the fundamental way that we go about storing information about transactions today. For this house, for example, if we needed to get a record of who owns this house and what happens to it, we would store that information in a ledger that looks like this. First, the house is built, then it's constructed, and there are some changes that go with it. It had some violations here and there, but eventually we'd be able to get a record of this house before we buy it. Anyone here ever bought a house or sold a house? How long does it take to get this information? You have to go to a title company. 30% of the titles in the United States have errors in them. The problem with the ledgers that we use today, which we depend on to trust, many things, not just houses, is that someone, as easily as they can write a record on the ledger, they can delete a record from the ledger. Can you imagine buying a house and you go to the homeowner and they go, yes, of course, here's the title. I've kept all the records of the title. Please have it. Would you trust them? No, because the information can be tampered with. The ledgers that we use today to transact with, whether it's a house, a car, the rights to some piece of art, someone who owns a piece of intellectual property or a patent, are tamperable. You can tamper with them. And what makes it worse is not only are they tamperable as in you can remove a record, you could also add a record or edit a record. As you can see here, that chimney violation that happens to this house somehow magically is now a new chimney. I bet you'd be paying a price you don't want to pay for that house. So we have this capability called a ledger. We use it, it's tamperable, and we could trust a little bit, but we're sort of in this state of commerce where we have to trust but verify. Anybody knows who said trust but verify? All right, good. We'll add it to the comment section as well. Okay? The truth is, today, as a civilization, when we start companies or we start transactions, we start with an automatic assumption that the counterparty cannot be trusted. When we start companies or we start transactions today, we start with the automatic assumption that the counterparty cannot be trusted. It almost feels normal to us. Kind of feels like, oh yeah, I mean, why would we not do that? What does it have to be that way? It's just something that we've become accustomed to. And the way we've gone about it is we establish these things called intermediaries. It's a fancy word for middlemen and middlewomen. Intermediaries. These are entities that are responsible for keeping a centralized copy of the ledgers in all of commerce, and they facilitate the brokering of the relationship between those who are looking to trust and those who are looking to be trusted. Examples of intermediaries are things like banks. The Department of Motor Vehicle, it's a great intermediary for identity. Mortgage, title companies. Credit reporting agencies. These are all intermediaries. This is just a small example of the intermediaries that we deal with today. And the reason why we deal with them is because we simply can't trust the ledgers that we have. Now, the intermediaries don't actually get us all the way there. If you think about operating in zero trust, which commerce would come to a stalling halt, and abundant trust, the intermediaries kind of get us to a point where we can manufacture some and the rest of it comes from the gut. The fact is, commerce and the state that it is in today, we sort of exist in this trust gap. Now, I should remind you that the oversimplification is still happening. Let's talk a little bit about blockchain to get a sense as to what blockchain is and what it does. As you would imagine, blockchain has a ledger as well. Now, the blockchain ledger is an epic upgrade on the ledger that we have today. There's a couple of things that are very, very interesting about it. The first thing that's interesting about the blockchain ledger is every record that's written on a blockchain ledger has a unique key that goes with it. Now, you don't need to get into the details of cryptography or hash keys, etc. Just trust me when I tell you that there's a really, really awesome, unhackable key that's in every record on a blockchain ledger. The other thing that happens to blockchain is that every record is written and stamped by the trusted party that wrote that record. Aha! You can see how this is a little bit different from the crappy ledger we use today, isn't it? Here's the major invention. When the next record is written, everything from the first record, including the key and the contents of the second record, is put into that formula, and out comes a key for the second record. You can see there's some dependency now. When the third record is written, the third record, the same thing happens. All of the contents of record number 1, including the key, and the contents of record number 2, including the key, goes into the formula, and out comes a key for the third record. You can see how the dependency from one record to another is different from what we do today. Now again, we're in the oversimplification zone. There's going to be a lot of comments about cryptography and hash keys. Yes, all that is important, but this is the fundamental difference. And this happens on and on and on and on. Essentially, technology making sure that every single record, we can see who wrote the record, we can add a key to that record, and we can build dependencies between one record and another, essentially chaining all of the records together. Aha! Now you see where the word chain comes from in blockchain. And here's what happens. If someone that doesn't like that failed chimney inspection decides to remove that, very quickly with an algorithm, you can apply it and look at the information and recognize that it was tampered with. That is the difference between how we exist today as commerce and how we will exist tomorrow in the future. Essentially, we're in a world where we can start to take advantage of a ledger that is immutable. Meaning, yes, you can mess with it, but it's really easy to tell the ones that were tampered with as opposed to the ones that are not tampered with. Now, blockchains usually exist in what is called communities. What you find is that participants that operate in an industry will all operate on the same chain so that each participant in that industry has a copy of the information so they can write to the ledger with each other. Now, this helps the sharing, this helps the transaction throughput, etc. You could call this the real estate chain, if I may. We're still talking about that house that we're buying. Obviously, there's going to be healthcare chain, there's going to be financial services chains, there'll be all industry chains, and eventually we'll see a chain of chains. Now, if someone happens to interfere with one of those ledgers, let's say something happens, a consensus algorithm runs, looks at all the rest of ledgers and says, hey, you're the one that's out. And it gets replaced by a copy of those that still has the good information. New blocks of transactions appear. They get written on top of the collection of ledger. New blocks of transactions appear. They get written on top of it. And eventually, we get into a situation where what you're looking at is what is called a distributed immutable ledger.